Hi everyone, welcome to part 5 of the Sensory Integration Assessment series. And today we are continuing with the vestibular system, but talking more specifically about registration and discrimination of vestibular input and how that can influence what you see with students in school districts or in your pediatric practice. But before we get started, I just wanted to really emphasize the importance of making sure that when you're doing a sensory integration assessment, that you're really taking a good look at registration and discrimination of sensory input, because what I've noticed is that a lot of OTs out there are really only looking at sensory modulation. So they're looking at how sensory input might impact the child's arousal level in the schools, or they're looking at just more like almost sensory diet types of things that you can do to help arousal level or their ability to sit, things like that. But they're really not looking at how the registration discrimination of sensory input can really influence a child's functioning. So they're not really taking that piece into account and realizing that that is also part of sensory integration. It's not just about sensory modulation. And I had to say that just because I was helping out with some OT interviews for my school district just this past week. And that's really what I noticed was when, people are talking about sensory integration, they're really confusing sensory integration and what that means with just like almost like sensory diet, right? Like activity, like if you just giving the kid a wiggle cushion, but they're not really addressing that foundational problem, which in a school district, it is possible to address that foundational problem if during your assessment, you're really seeing that, it is a vestibular registration discrimination of input problem, that's what needs to be addressed in treatment. So that's my little soapbox. I'm done. And we are moving on with the vestibular system. And this system is, like I said in my last video, it's a very complicated system because there's a lot going on. Just with the neural pathways, you have your descending pathways that are going from the vestibular input up in the ear, and they're going down, descending the spinal cord. And those pathways are controlling the postural control, equilibrium, muscle tone, extensor tone. And that's where you're getting kids with postural control difficulties or neck and trunk extension difficulties. So in the school district, this is what you're checking. You're wanting to see if the child has difficulty remaining upright in their chair. Does the child have difficulty adjusting their posture? Does the child look like they're having difficulty controlling their movements, or their movements look very sloppy, very ungraded? And does the child often lay their head on the desk? So those observations indicate difficulties with a child's postural control and their neck and trunk extension. And in addition to that, I usually do try and see if I'm already seeing postural control difficulties. I usually do want to do a prone extension and supine flexion just to check the extensor tone and neck stability. You will see kids who have just a very difficult time with their postural control and their just neck stability. Prone extension and supine flexion, like supine flexion, especially with the neck, they just have such a hard time pulling their neck up against gravity, and they will say like it hurts, you know, it is not easy for them. So you'll see that immediately if this is a difficult area for them. And then the next thing you really do want to check is ocular motor control, because that is such an important part of the functional activity of copying from the board. So you want to see if their vestibular ocular pathway, if they're having difficulty with that. And so usually what I will do is I will perform a stable visual field, eye tracking, and quick localization tasks on the child. So these are all actual visual tracking types of things that you want to just check out. Then you want to see, does the child have difficulty copying from the board? Is it much more labor, taking them much longer than their peers to be able to do? And that's great information that you can get from the teacher as well. And usually for kids that have difficulty with eye tracking, after a long school day, they're fatigued because they've been using their eyes to do so many functional tasks, because, you know, schools require a lot of those kinds of tasks of copying and, you know, doing work, paper, pencil, all of that. So they usually are tired at the end of the day. So all of these items are really an under-responsiveness to vestibular input, which results in poor registration and discrimination of the vestibular input, which causes these difficulties. The other area that you will see with the vestibular system is you will have kids that actually have a vestibular bilateral integration deficit. So during my assessment, I usually do try and see, does the child have the ability to do jumping jacks? Can they do hopscotch? Can they skip? Can they gallop? Can they do alternating jumps? Things like that. And, you know, like if you're doing a standardized assessment, if you're doing the Brunex, the BOT, it has that bilateral coordination part of the assessment where you can use, if you want something more standardized, you can use that. The MFUN also has, you know, bilateral coordination piece to it as well for gross motor types of activities. But in general, I just go ahead and just do general activities like jumping jacks, hopscotch, skipping, things that you would typically have them do, you know, or they would need to do during PE to see what their bilateral coordination looks like. And then as well, you would take a look at their bilateral coordination with fine motor activities. So are they able to hold their paper while also using scissors and cutting? Can they string beads? So that would be, you know, at the preschool level. Are they really having a hard time coordinating, you know, putting the bead on, but then like transferring it over and pulling it across midline? And then you want to see, are they spontaneously holding their paper when they're writing? You know, when you see kids that have bilateral integration deficits, sometimes they really just are using one hand. They're not using both hands in a coordinated manner. And then another thing that you will see for sure in kids with bilateral coordination integration types of deficits is that the child's overall rhythm and fluidity is going to be poor. You know, they have a really hard time, and you can even just do, you know, like a simple clapping, like, you know, like this type of a thing. And that's like also on in the BOT, you know, it has that piece where you can see them do, you know, like they have this one where it looks like itsy bitsy spider going up. You'll see, can they do like alternating jumps? Can they, do they have the rhythm to be able to tap on the table? And you can do these without doing it standardized as well, and just have them copy you with movements and see if they're able to coordinate that rhythm and fluidity, because if that's very difficult for them, they usually also do have bilateral coordination type difficulties. So bilateral integration deficits are a result of poor vestibular and proprioceptive processing. So usually you will see that they do have some sort of proprioceptive problem and or somatodyspraxia. So what you'll have to do is, if you're seeing that the child is having a really difficult time, let's say with skipping and jumping jacks, you will also want to see, okay, well, does the child also have some tactile processing difficulties? And if they also have tactile processing and then proprioceptive processing, it probably is more of a somatodyspraxic problem. But if their tactile processing is actually okay, like they have pretty good stereognosis, they have pretty good, like, tactile, like localization, things like that, but they really just can't coordinate their body, then it's maybe more truly a bilateral integration deficit that is more vestibular and proprioceptive based rather than somatodyspraxia. So you just have to kind of figure all that out as you see a child and pull that out. If you do a very, very thorough assessment that assesses all those areas, you should be able to easily see whether it's a true bilateral coordination type of deficit because it's a vestibular and proprioceptive difficulty, or if the child is just somatodyspraxic. So if they're somatodyspraxic, jumping jacks, skipping, all those things are going to be difficult for them as well, because they have a hard time with just their overall body awareness, right, with the tactile and proprioceptive difficulties. So hopefully that was all very helpful. I also have right here brainstem and cerebellum. So a lot of the vestibular input also goes through the brainstem and cerebellum. And so that's why you see that proprioceptive processing and vestibular processing are so integrated together because of this area, because all that input is going into, or all the proprioceptive and vestibular input is going into these areas in the brain. But we will talk a little bit more about the proprioceptive system next time, but I hope the vestibular system, just both those parts from last week and this week, make sense and are helpful. If not, please email me questions, and I hope you guys have a great week.